Hey everybody, welcome back to A View from Earth, brought to you by the Fisk Planetarium at CU Boulder. We hope you're all doing well and staying safe. Now, as with the rest of the university and many public spaces around the world, Fisk Theater is closed for the foreseeable future to the public due to the COVID-19 epidemic. However, we are all still so committed and excited to bringing you astronomy and education that we have started a whole host of free online offerings so that we can stay connected and keep bringing you the Fisk content that you know and love, plus some new stuff like this podcast. So thanks for tuning in and learning with us here today. My name is Tara. I am a planetary scientist, a CU alum, and I'm also the outreach coordinator and a presenter at the Planetarium. And my friend Colin is here too. Hi, Colin.
Ahoy, mateys. My name is Colin. I am an undergrad at CU. I am a presenter at the Planetarium, and now apparently also a pirate. Back to you, Tara.
Thanks, Colin. So today we are talking about, dun dun dun, life in the universe. We're approaching it from two different directions. We're going to talk a little bit about bioastronautics with our guest, Dr. Luis Zea. We also have Dr. Bruce Jakosky, who's going to tell us a little bit about astrobiology. And you'll get a good feel about what the difference is between the two of those. These are excerpts from our interviews with these guys, so we hope you enjoy those. But first, the news. And here to give us a bit of the news about exoplanets is our friend Sophie. Sophie, introduce yourself a little.
Hi, so I'm Sophie. I am a senior at CU Boulder. I am a TAM major here in, I guess, my 5th year, and I love astronomy, and it's my passion, and I love sharing information about it. So I'm super excited to share information about life elsewhere in the universe with you today. Cool. So before we get started, I wanted to thank my friend Justin Wang for taking the time to let me interview him and for sharing all the information that you'll be hearing today. He's a double major in astrophysics and molecular, cellular, and developmental biology with a minor in biochem. And he's worked in astrobiology research at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Science during his time at CU. Ultimately, he hopes to be an astronaut. So the search for life elsewhere in the universe has two veins of research: life outside of our solar system and life within our solar system. The search for life outside of our solar system is being conducted through NASA's Kepler and TESS missions. These missions have found thousands of planets orbiting around other stars, which we call exoplanets. Scientists look for certain characteristics in these planets for them to possibly be able to support life. These characteristics include the size of the planet, the distance from their sun, where the other planets in their solar system are located in relation to the target planet, and the shape of their orbit. If all of these characteristics fall under what we call the habitable zone, then scientists look more closely at these planets for signs of life. So for example, Mars is at the edge of a few habitable zones in our own solar system. It's a little bit too far away from our sun to support life, and it's also a little bit too small. But you may be more aware of the search for life within our own solar system. In 2017, NASA's Mars Renaissance Orbiter, or MRO, discovered evidence that liquid water flows intermittently on Mars today. Since we know life needs water to survive, NASA deploys missions to ancient river deltas and streams on the surface to Mars to investigate further. It's hotly debated how long water has existed on the surface of Mars. Some believe water flowed on the surface for billions of years, which is long enough for life to develop. But others believe that water on the surface of Mars was short-lived, and that the best place to search for life on Mars would be ancient sites of volcanic activity that were more continuous, yet could also be extremely hot and toxic, though we know that life here on Earth can live in those kind of environments. While we are still in search of present life on Mars, a lot of the ongoing Martian astrobiology research is rather the search for evidence that life once existed on Mars. Europa has also been a large focus of our extraterrestrial research. We have observed that the moon has a large water ice shell and infer and hope that there is a liquid ocean under the surface. Europa is extremely cold, and any life that may exist under the surface of ice wouldn't have access to the sun. So instead of creating energy from photosynthesis, any living microorganism under the surface of ice would need to derive their energy from chemical energy from the moon itself. NASA's Clipper mission is scheduled to launch to Europa in 2024 to gather more information. Part of the search for life elsewhere includes learning how life began and persevered here on Earth. The most accepted theory today on how life formed on Earth was around the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of our oceans. Since the environments are so extreme on the surface of Mars and Europa, scientists investigate these hydrothermal vents in hopes to learn more about microorganisms that are able to thrive in these harsh conditions. They also investigate other places that provide extreme conditions for life, such as the hot springs in Yellowstone and the northern Arctic. These places are called analog environments, environments that mimic the geochemistry on the surface of another planet. By studying these places, scientists hope to gain information that could help lead them to track down microorganisms living in extreme conditions on Mars and Europa. We are also looking a little bit less intensely at Titan and Enceladus, which are two Saturn's moons. Enceladus, like Europa, is made of ice. We have observed water geysers shooting from the surface of the moon, but because we are more focused on Europa at the moment, we do not have any scheduled missions to Enceladus. However, missions most likely will begin to be sent to Enceladus in the next few decades. Titan, on the other hand, has a very different environment than what we're used to observing. Its surface is so cold that methane exists in liquid form. Titan has a methane cycle very similar to the water cycle here on Earth. It rains methane, there are methane clouds, and there are lakes of methane. Scientists are not looking at Titan as seriously as Europa and Mars because it's too cold for liquid water. However, my friend Justin believes that we still need to investigate Titan more because we need to remember that life might not exist as we know it here on Earth. If methane acts as water on this moon, what if life can be created from methane instead of water? Although there are many discrepancies between scientists on the places that may support or may have supported life in the past, many scientists believe that life does or has existed somewhere else in the universe beyond Earth. And if it didn't, that'd be a whole waste of space.
Excellent.
Very
Thank you.
cool. Thanks for putting that together for us, Sophie.
Of course.
So now we are speaking with Dr. Luis Zia, who's an assistant research professor for CU Boulder Aerospace, and he specializes in the intriguing field of bioastronautics, which is studying how biology and space interact. His interests span everything from gravitational microbiology to biomining and bio-based resource utilization. His work asks questions like, how can we protect our astronauts from bacterial contamination? Or how can microorganisms help us mine metals from asteroids? Dr. Z is also part of the Artemis program, leading an investigation to use yeast to study the radiation environment of the moon. This all sounds so fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Jumping right into your projects, Tara and I were talking about how your website, looking through your website is like it looks like reading a sci-fi novel or something. Like all of these different projects that you're working on are just crazy. So one of these projects in particular is examining how biofilms behave in space. And biofilms are groups of bacteria or fungus that stick together, like the kind that you find in your shower or on your teeth. You can correct us if that's wrong. But that's our understanding for everyone listening. That's a biofilm. And much like we never think about them in the bathroom until it's too late, I've never considered that they would grow in space too. How are you conducting this experiment? And are you just characterizing them at this point, or are you also actively testing ways to mitigate them?
Yeah, no, you got it right. Except for you said biofilms grow in your bathroom and your teeth. The correction is they don't grow in my teeth. All right, I'm exceptional. Yeah, that's actually right, and that's why we brush our teeth, all of us. Because even if you were to be just rinsing it with, like mouthwash, that is not enough of a mechanical stress to remove them from our teeth. They are biofilms, as you mentioned, bacteria and fungi, mostly bacteria. Otherwise, fungi, when they're forming biofilms, are usually called molds. Technically, you can use both. But these bacteria, for example, in people's mouths, in our teeth, they secrete these substances that allow them to adhere to a surface. And once they're there, good luck. You need really hard brushing. And that's not only a problem for astronauts' teeth, but it's also a problem for, well, we were mentioning before, of ECLAS, environmental control on life support systems, what keeps the astronauts alive in space. And let's go for another quick time travel. And now it's about space stations on orbit and what biofilms problems they have had. So the first big space station, the Soviet Salyut 6, it had several biofilm problems. They saw it forming inside pipings and behind panels. The Soviet Salyut 7, they had it on the water recycling system. That's a place you don't want it. Rubber of hatch locks. So if you think about it, the doors, if you will, on space stations or spacecraft, they have it's like an O-ring, right? It's a seal to make sure that gases are not going anywhere. Now, biofilms are a problem for two reasons. One is because of the health problems they can bring. In fact, most of bacterial infections in humans have a biofilm association to them, meaning that bacteria tend to be in a biofilm state when they are causing the disease. And the other one is because they can degrade the material. So they can basically eat away the plastic or metals upon which they are growing. They can be acidic, they can be corrosive. So if you have this kind of stuff growing on an O-ring that keeps your air in your spacecraft, that's not a good thing, because now you have little pads of air leaking. And if you have it in your water recycling system, as I mentioned, there's also this medical aspect of it can get people sick if it's the wrong kind of bug. So also you don't want it anywhere close your water, right? And then if we keep on the time travel, the Soviet/Russian Mir space station, it had it on a bunch of different places: air conditioning, the oxygen electrolysis block, the water recycling unit, even on an extravehicular activity suits headphone. This is the cool suit that you saw. What was that movie, Gravity, with all that wrong stuff, but also some pretty cool looking stuff. Yeah, so those are the EVA suits. On the Mir space station, they had biofilm growing in one of the suit's headphones. And very interestingly, one case was on a navigation window. So they had this quartz window that the cosmonauts would use to look out and see the spacecraft that was arriving, the progress with cargo and stuff they needed. And they would kind of like play video games, but real life, and bringing it. Now that navigation window was going through problems of what eventually they later learned was a fungi called Penicillium rubens. It was called Penicillium chrysogenum, but it got its name changed. It wasn't cool enough, so it went for the rubens. And you don't want your navigation window not to be perfectly clear, right? And you don't want that jeopardized by biofilms. And so it's been a problem for a very long time. In fact, there's this really cool story of when astronauts, US astronauts, were able to go to the Mir space station and telling stories, and also these stories also coming from cosmonauts of, for example, a really bad stench. And people are like, what the hell is that smell? And you are living in this very tiny space. You don't want to be smelling that kind of stuff. Like right now, we're all quarantined, right? We take our trash out, because imagine being quarantined and smelling that stuff all the time. And so they find out it was coming from a panel. So they remove the control panel and they see all this biofilm growing on the back. Now that's bad for a lot of reasons. But remember how I was saying that biofilms can degrade polymers, the plastic, for example, that covers cables and wires? Big no-no. You don't want another fire there, right? So that's another kind of problem of biodegradation, of how these bugs can cause problems. And of course, this is true not only in Russian and Soviet space stations, it was also true, and it's also true still on the International Space Station. And that's the reason for which NASA is currently supporting research in this field, because especially there's a challenge making sure there's no biofilm growth on the wastewater tank, which is part of the water processing assembly of ISS Cyclus.
Well, kind of moving forward, I also want to ask you about your mission on the Artemis program. You're a co-PI for this. We talked about Artemis a little bit last week with Dr. Hain, and you're particularly studying how radiation in the moon's environment could affect cells and DNA using yeast. Can you kind of tell us a little more about how this works? Because this is really strange.
Yeah, right. Yeast. That's what we use for making bread and beer. Yeah, actually, when you see the genome, which is the genetic code of yeast, over 70% of their most important genes are also found on the human genome. So that makes them a really good model organism, is what we call it. For example, imagine if I want to have really strong statistical data that I can do studies with. I would need to send thousands or millions of humans to deep space and analyze changes, right? However, in a tiny little vial, I can send millions upon millions of yeast cells, and each of them have their own DNA. Each of them have their own genome, and that allows us to do very massive studies with genes that are also found either directly on the human genome or they have equivalent genomes. And that's the kind of like the reason. And why on Artemis? So Earth is protected by the magnetosphere, right? So if we were to cut the Earth in half, which I hope nobody has the powers to do because that would be a bad day, you would see something like an apple, where the Earth is a circle in the center, and then you would see these two kind of ovals that go outside of the circle, and that's our magnetosphere, right? It has multiple layers, and this magnetic field protects us from some of the solar particles that are always irradiating our way, but also from galactic cosmic rays, which sounds very sci-fi, but it's really real. And that's the reason for which we're not getting cooked, right? But once we are beyond the Van Allen belts, astronauts are going to be exposed to that high radiation environment. And we haven't had an opportunity to send a controlled biological experiment beyond the Van Allen belt since 1972 on Apollo 17. So when NASA put out a call for proposals, I was shaking of excitement. And of course, I partnered with Corey Nislow. He's a professor at the University of British Columbia, and he has this really cool things called deletion series and overexpression series of yeast. And if think of the genome of the genetic code of anything, say in this case yeast, of like a bunch of Lego pieces, making a little train. In this case, it's about a 4,000 Lego piece long train where each Lego is one of the genes. With what he does with his deletion series is he makes, imagine, 4,000 copies, and on the first copy, he removes one of the Lego pieces. And instead of that, he puts a little flag. And the next one, he removes the second Lego piece and puts a flag. Basically, it's called a deletion series because each of those mutants has had one gene deleted. And the overexpression series is the opposite. Instead of deleting one gene, he puts a bunch of that gene in that space. And what we're going to do is, at BioServe Space Technologies, which is where I work, it's a nonprofit research center within the University of Colorado. We build hardware and we help we help scientists send their experiments to space. We train the astronauts, we develop the hardware, all the NASA safety support documentation, etc. So what we're doing at BioServe is building the autonomous hardware, which of course, this is space, so it has to have an acronym. It's called PLASM. And PLASM gets no data, no power, no communication, no nothing from Orion. And still, we need to be able to know when we're past the Van Allen belt and activate the experiment. That's what we're going to be doing, activating this deletion and overexpression series, then letting them grow under the microgravity and high radiation environment of deep space. And then we're going to make a correlation of which of the mutants had higher rates of survivability than the others. And this allows us to make a study of the effects of both microgravity and high radiation on DNA damage. Another really cool thing is that yeast has DNA repair mechanisms that are also similar to what happens on humans. We don't get cancer as often as it could be, thanks in part to the DNA repair mechanisms that we have. Imagine this DNA strand, and there are these little molecular robots that swim through it, checking for any inconsistencies. And when they found something that like, oh, wait a minute, this should not be a G, this should be a C. And they recruit these other molecular robots and they fix it. Well, and you want to make sure that this repair happens before the cell splits in two. If the damage was not repaired before the cell splits in two, now that's going to be part of its genome, and that those two cells are going to become 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. That's one of the bases of cancer, when this mutation just takes over. So it's pretty important to understand if we are going to have higher rates of DNA damage in deep space. We know we will, but we don't really have that problem quantified. And the other aspect is we also want to see if the DNA repair mechanisms are acting in any different way.
So what I'm realizing as we're talking to you is that this is going to be a very difficult episode to cut, because I will want to keep every word that you're saying because this is so interesting.
Don't cut it, Colin. Don't cut it.
Don't do it.
All right.
So moving forward in some of your, another one of your sci-fi sounding projects that is sci non-fi, you are involved in something called biomining, which to our understanding is using organisms to mine for metals like iron on the moon. What sort of organisms are these? How does it work? What are the 44 endangered elements that you mention on your website? Also, quick plug to your website. Anyone listening, the website is awesome, so check it out. You can find it if you just search like colorado.edu space Luis Zia, and we might hyperlink it somewhere. It's a really cool website. Anyways, back to you, Luis.
All right, thanks. Yeah, maybe every time we say the word space biomining, John should put like a cool sci-fi background on the podcast. Yeah, it sounds really sci-fi. In fact, it is not. And something that a lot of people don't know is that between 5 and 15% of gold and copper that is mined on Earth comes from biomining processes. So I'm sure that the first person who thought of biomining on Earth probably got laughed at a lot, because that was totally sci-fi, more on the fi. And but in fact now it is not, because we use it a lot on Earth. So where comes the novelty of this is implementing these kind of processes for in situ resource utilization. So making sure we can live off the land as we go to cool places like the moon, Mars, and beyond. And there's this one bacteria called Shigella oneidensis, and it has the capability to transfer electrons with minerals that are outside of it. So it's called an exoelectrogen. And what it does, it can help us reduce iron. So iron present on the regolith, on the dust, it can be oxidized. And imagine it's called iron 3. And then Shigella goes there, it eats, it does its thing, and it transformed that iron 3 that was in the mineral into iron 2 that is now in solution, in a liquid, that you can then segregate from the rest. And that's how you could potentially extract minerals. We're starting with iron in the lab, because that's something that there's a lot of research on how Shigella does that. But what we're doing here is that we're growing on a spaceflight hardware, those FPAs and gaps that I was talking about, and we are exposing it to regolith simulant. So we don't have, you can't go to a grocery store and like, hey, can I have a pound of lunar dust? But there's this really cool lab at the University of Central Florida, where it's actually where I did my master's, go Knights, and this called the Class Exolith Lab. And they actually synthesize regolith simulant from different places of different bodies. And that's how we have asteroid, lunar, and Martian regolith simulants. So they have what we understand are equivalent constituents. That's the same ingredients, right? And we're growing the Shigella with these different kind of regolith simulants in flight hardware, like we would do in a potential spaceflight experiment, which we're still not yet planning. We're just learning the ropes here. And the idea is that eventually you can have these tanks where the bug is happy, you're giving it the food it wants, it can do this electron transfer, and then it will give you things that you can need for other things. For example, if you have this bioreactor where you just put a bunch of dust and these little things with bacteria and its growth medium, and on the other end you're getting purified iron, then you can feed that to 3D printers, and you can build structures, you can build parts, and there's a bunch of metals that you can do. And you mentioned the 44 endangered elements, and that's the idea, that this could support not only space, having folks out there in space, but it can also be brought back to Earth. Imagine how cool a world would be in the far future where Earth is declared a no mining zone, like no heavy industries, and Earth is a living zone. We could do mining off asteroids, and that's where we get all the stuff we need, or at least part of it. And biomining could be a part of it as well, because it can help you potentially extract some of those endangered elements, which are the elements for which we know there's going to be a supply. There's not going to be enough production of them in the upcoming years.
So we did want to kind of here towards the end ask you a couple of little more personal questions, just kind of about what you do in your journey and how you got here. And on your CV, it talks about you started your education in mechanical engineering and then aerospace engineering and then bioastronautics. So have you always had this interest in space or space science, or is this something you kind of gradually worked your way into?
Oh no, it wasn't my genome. For sure, it was there from the beginning. And I'm from Guatemala, as I mentioned, so we didn't have the resources for me to come to the States, so I wasn't sure I was going to be able to. I started as a not a great student, meaning I was a terrible student. And then when I realized that I wanted to do space stuff, and in order to be able to come to the States and do this, that I needed a scholarship, that's when my life changed. I did skateboarding for a living, so my priorities was first was skateboarding, and then a number 2 was skateboarding, and number 3 and 4 skateboarding, and 5 maybe if I had time left, it was school. So when I realized how things worked, I changed my life and really focused on studying and trying to be a better student. This is in high school still, middle school, high school. And then I wasn't able to get any scholarships because I had all these years of slacking, right? I ended up well, but I had all this history of not doing great. So I learned German as a plan B so that I could apply to Germany. I learned Portuguese as a plan C in case I couldn't come to the States or Germany. I would try to go to Brazil to study aerospace. I did an undergrad in Guatemala to get my stuff together and get that degree, and that's how I was able to come to the States as a graduate research assistant, where I worked helping with research, and that was what pays for your tuition, basically. And that was in petroleum engineering. And that's because after my undergrad, I still couldn't find a way to come outside of Guatemala to study aerospace. So I got a job as a mechanical engineer in the oil industry, and actually it had nothing to do with oil. All I was doing was Excel, and that's what helped me get my foot on the door. Then I did aerospace. Then I couldn't really get anything into aerospace because I wasn't a resident or a citizen. So I got a job as a heat transfer engineer. And then I went back to school for a PhD here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Now I'm a citizen and I'm able to work on all this cool stuff. So life takes you different ways. Life really is a zigzag. And that's kind of the message I would say to younger folks. Just keep a mind open, plan for a plan B. The more tools you put in your toolbox, languages, software, stuff, the better for you.
That is an awesome story. Like, just that whole progression that's just fascinating.
I love hearing these too, because it seems like pretty much everyone that we've talked to, nobody has had a real like linear path of how they got from A to B to C. Everybody's kind of been, started here, and we had some musicians and we had some bio folks, and everybody kind of winds their way. Nobody really just goes straight. And I think that's awesome.
So the question that we like to wrap up with a lot is, and you've actually touched on this several times, which is awesome, but I'll ask you to kind of summarize everything that you've said in this vein. What advice do you have to young people who, after listening to this, say, wow, that Dr. Zia guy is awesome and hilarious and sounds like he's having a great time and I want to go do that? And so they say, okay, I know I'm into bioastronautics. What advice, if you could wrap all of those different tidbits of advice that you've listed over this last hour, what advice do you give to young people who now want to pursue this as a career?
You say you want me to wrap it or wrap it? You want me to freestyle right now?
If you can wrap it, that would be awesome.
That would be too hard, Colin. So I'm just going to go with non-wrap. I'm going to wrap it.
Okay.
So it depends on the age. If it's elementary or middle school or even high school, I would say grades matter. See, I always thought, why is my mom giving me such a hard time about my grades? Who cares about the grades? You will in your future. It opens doors. You know, these movies where you have this magical key that opens this magical door to who knows where? Those are your grades. Extracurricular activities. Once more than one person is applying to a position, to either a job or grad school, you're going to be compared against in a quantitatively way, meaning that you want to make yourself stronger a case than others. And one way you can do that is through extracurriculars. And it can be based on what it is that you want to do. It can be languages. If you want to go into computer stuff, then different software languages or different software. So this kind of extracurricular, start a student group, these kind of things. Volunteering, I think it's very important. But really, you got to do it if it comes from the heart. But there's so many different things in which you can volunteer. We are always more fortunate than a lot of other people. So finding time to help others, it's pretty important. And then if you're older and now you're kind of like at college, you're getting so old. Then same thing of grades and extracurricular, but don't forget the multidisciplinarity of real life. And it's important to know more than one trait. It's going to help you a lot. Stay positive and keep working hard.
I think that is a perfect way to wrap up the episode. Dr. Luis Zia, thank you so much for joining us today. That was absolutely a pleasure to talk with you.
Likewise, thank you for having me. It was really nice talking to you, Tara and Colin.
So now we are speaking with Dr. Bruce Jakosky, who is a professor at CU Boulder, an associate director for science, the associate director for science at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, also known as LASP. He is the principal investigator for the MAVEN spacecraft mission and newly appointed member of the National Space Council Users Advisory Group. His expertise in geology and cosmochemistry makes him a leading expert in Mars's atmosphere and what it would take to make the red planet habitable. In fact, he's authored 2 books on the search for life in the universe and leads the CU's team for NASA's Astrobiology Institute. If anyone knows how to create a livable Mars, it's Dr. Jakosky. But does he think we can do it? Dr. Jakosky, thanks so much for being with us today.
Real pleasure to be here today.
We'll start off with the question that might seem kind of trivial, but is important for the success of this episode, which is, what is astrobiology?
Astrobiology is all about trying to understand the origin, the distribution of life in the universe. We know that the Earth has life. It's the only place we know of that does. But we can ask the question, where else in our solar system might life exist? What about recent planets that have been discovered orbiting other stars? Could life exist there? It's all about understanding the relationship between life and its planetary environment and where conditions might be met that could support an origin of life or could support the continued existence of life.
So this is kind of in contrast to what we were talking about with our other guest, which is how can we support life that started on Earth and thrive in space? But astrobiology is kind of the opposite. We're looking at life that has no relationship to Earth and is just out there, living.
Well, yeah, yes and no. If we think about life on Mars, for example, Mars meets all the environmental requirements we'd put forward as being necessary to support life. Things like liquid water, all of the different elements out of which you might construct life, and a source of energy, either through sunlight or chemical reactions that could support metabolism. But Mars doesn't have to have had an independent origin of life in order to have life. You can have living organisms transferred between planets. On Earth, for example, there are organisms that live inside of rocks, in the water that fills pore spaces in the rock. And if one of those rocks happens to get ejected by an asteroid impact, it could find its way to Mars and transfer life there. So it's possible if we find life on Mars that it might have come from Earth. It's also possible it could go the other way, that if we find life on Mars or evidence for ancient life on Mars, that could be where the origin of life occurred, and life on Earth had been transferred here from Mars. That's one of the fundamental questions that I think will be really interesting to try to answer.
So then let me put this to you, and this is a question that people ask all the time. If there's so many opportunities for life to be out there, why haven't we found it yet? Why haven't they contacted us? Why don't we see any of this life just yet?
Well, there are a lot of really good questions locked up in that one simple question. The first is, let's distinguish between microbial life and intelligent life. I don't expect microbes to contact us. They just aren't capable of building even primitive radio systems. But we can discover evidence for microbes. We've sent a spacecraft to Mars in the 1970s to look for evidence for life. It turns out in hindsight that the experiments on the Viking spacecraft were not really the right ones but they were at the time based on what we knew about life. Today, we would send a different set of experiments. In addition, we had the issue of looking for life in what's called the Allen Hills meteorite. It's a rock from Mars, about this big, about the size of a really big baked potato, that was knocked off of Mars by an impact and came to Earth. Some people thought that they were seeing evidence for life, evidence for fossil life inside of it. It took, once that proposal was put forward, it took a team of maybe 500 scientists, half a dozen years of analysis to reach a consensus on whether they were seeing evidence for life. That consensus was probably not. But it's not an easy question to answer. You pick up a rock and ask, does it have evidence inside of it for life? You have to do a lot of analysis to get a definitive answer. The question about intelligent life is a very different one. People are looking for signals that might be transmitted by intelligent life that we might intercept. And it is a fair question to ask, if life is so widespread, where is it? How come they haven't come here? And there are a lot of hypotheses put forward as to why that might be the case. Everything from, we're so primitive they don't want to bother with us, to they're already here and just watching us, biding their time until we demonstrate that we're a species worth interacting with.
So moving towards your profession as a professor with the University of Colorado, you teach courses across a range of subjects, but some of the points that you like to touch on, and I'm just pulling this from your website, so perhaps this is false, but you can verify for us. It sounds like some of the points you like to touch on are those related to societal and philosophical issues that relate to astrobiology. What are some of these issues?
Well, we've been getting at some of them. Are we alone in the universe? What does that mean for our perception of who we are as individuals or as a society? People are interested in this question of life elsewhere because we are life. We exist in our planetary environment, and it's of interest to know, are we alone, or there are other organisms? Again, I think the answer will have profound implications. If you think about it, you can look in our history for examples of how of what some of the implications might be. The best analogy would be the Copernican revolution, the recognition that the sun and the planets don't revolve around the Earth, but the Earth goes around the sun. In some sense, that had the effect of displacing humans from the center of the universe. And at that time when that happened, it was a really big deal. You know, does it make a difference to you or me whether the Earth goes around the sun or the sun around the Earth? No, you'd be hard pressed to think of ways in which it really makes a real difference to you in your day-to-day life. But it's a profound difference in terms of the place of humans in the universe. And it created upheaval at the time. There was you can imagine it started what people have called a big battle between science and religion. Who has control over the description of the world? I think the recognition that if we find life, that we're not the only life in the universe, would have the same effect of displacing humans from the center of the universe, displacing terrestrial life from the center of the biological universe. And I think it's a set of issues we'd have to deal with. I think finding evidence for life would be profound. Looking where we think there should be evidence, where there should be life if it exists elsewhere, and finding none would be profound just as well.
So we've talked a little bit about Mars already, and we mentioned in your bio you are the PI of the MAVEN mission. Can you tell us a little bit about MAVEN and kind of how that relates to astrobiology?
I see MAVEN as an astrobiology mission. MAVEN is the Mars Atmosphere and Volatile Evolution mission. The N in MAVEN is the N at the end of evolution, so it's not a true acronym. And I've taken a lot of grief for that over the years. But the MAVEN mission is focused on studying part of the Mars system that really hasn't been studied, and that's the top of the atmosphere. That's the boundary between the thick lower atmosphere where all the weather occurs and space. The upper atmosphere is where the sun, through its sunlight, through the solar wind, interacts, and it's able to strip gas off of the atmosphere. So we're learning about the physics and chemistry of the Mars upper atmosphere. At the same time, we're seeing how these processes lead to loss of the atmosphere to space. And the goal of MAVEN was to understand what drove the climate change on Mars that we infer from the geology. We see evidence that early Mars was warmer and wetter compared to today's cold and dry desert-like planet. What drove that change? What was the role played by stripping of the atmosphere to space by the sun and the solar wind? So as an aeronomy mission, which aeronomy is the study of the upper atmosphere, it's perfectly fine. But really, it's an astrobiology mission. We're trying to learn what controls the climate, what controlled, past tense, the climate on Mars, what could control the climate on Mars-like planets around other stars. We're looking at things that affect the history of liquid water on the surface, things that affect the temperature of the surface, and that control the habitability of Mars by microbes. All the evidence points to the surface of Mars as having been habitable by microbes at least 4 billion years ago, but not today. What controlled that? By understanding the relationship between climate and geology and possible biology, we're really studying the astrobiology of Mars.
So we're talking about all of these places in the solar system that could have life, right? That we say, okay, well, this is a thought. What, as a planetary scientist, when you look around, what do you see being the necessary features of the planetary surface that sustain life, or below the surface? Like Europa, for example, you mentioned that subsurface ocean. What are we looking for when we see all these different bodies?
With the current understanding of widespread life on Earth and life living in environments that we would have thought until recently were way too extreme, we've come up with a set of criteria for what could support life. And it's not very difficult. Liquid water, access to the biogenic elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and 22 others that are all present on any geologically active planet, and a source of energy that can drive metabolism. Really, any rocky planet that also has liquid water is going to meet these. And going to these places and looking to see whether there was an origin of life, whether there ever was life there, it's going to tell us a lot about what the requirements are, as well as what the distribution of life in the solar system is.
This is on the pretense that, the life that we're looking for is somehow related to the life that we know. And obviously that makes sense because, I think that a lot of people have heard people say, well, we can't start looking for what we don't know. We have, our starting place is us. We know that we exist and we know what features, make our lives possible. So we can look for those. What about things that, do you think that there is a life form that doesn't operate at all like we do? You've mentioned that, there's these elements that we're looking for and also like a source of energy. And how are these life forms, metabolizing and interacting with their environment? Like, are there, in your mind, is there a way that life could be completely different and we don't even know how any way to describe what it's doing or how it's working? Or is that not life as we're talking about it?
Well, first, it requires answering the question of what is life. And that's a very hard question to answer by itself. But also, how do you look for it? On Earth, we have a very simple way of looking for life. If we want to go outside and see if there's life there, we can pick up something, and the test is to determine whether it has RNA and DNA. On Earth, that appears to be a unique descriptor of whether something is alive or not. Now, you can imagine that there might be what people have called a shadow biosphere on Earth, organisms that exist and we haven't discovered them that don't use RNA and DNA? Maybe, maybe not. If we want to go to Mars and look for life, we could take the same RNA and DNA detectors and take them there. But if life isn't identical to Earth life, we're not going to discover it. So you have to think of other ways to look for evidence of life. You can look for it in physical structures like cells. You can look for it in patterns of chemicals, where certain chemicals are more abundant in a structure if it's been alive than if it hasn't been. You can look for patterns in the stable isotopes, different flavors of atoms that have different masses, where certain chemical reactions or living organisms that use chemical reactions prefer one isotope to another. What are you going to find? Don't know. We're trying to come up with ways to look for life that make as few assumptions as possible in order to not miss things. But we're always bound by our assumptions. Could there be life based on something other than carbon? People always talk about silicon-based life because silicon sits right below carbon on the periodic table. Well, on Earth, carbon reacts with hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. It makes these nice long chains of hydrocarbons that have properties that are, at least for us, appear very conducive to participating in life. Carbon can be present in the Earth's environment as a solid, as a liquid, as a gas. It can be present in the atmosphere. It can dissolve in water. It can precipitate out as carbon minerals. It can be taken up by organisms. Silicon can do all these things too, but when silicon combines with oxygen, it doesn't make long chains. It makes these what are called silicon tetrahedra that we think of as rock. And silicon can dissolve in water, but in very trace amounts. And you don't find much silicon or silicon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's not something we breathe in. So there are limits. I don't expect to find zinc-based life. Carbon is so abundant that it's probably not very limiting to assume that life would be carbon-based. Remember, silicon at the surface of the Earth is 10,000 times more abundant than carbon, yet life uses carbon. It's not just based on abundance. Similarly, water is a great liquid in which life can exist. It can dissolve things, it can precipitate things. If there's water on a planet, I would think it would be water-based life if there was any. But you go to Titan and you have methane, ethane oceans. Could there be methane, ethane-based life using those liquids instead of water? I wouldn't rule it out. It's not impossible.
All right, so we'll move on a little bit into what you do, and one of those things is writing books. You've written 2 of them. That they're called The Search for Life on Other Planets and Science, Society, and the Search for Life in the Universe. I'm curious, what drove you to write these books? Like what made you say, okay, it's now my time to write a book? And also, what's it like to write a book? Because that's pretty cool.
It certainly wasn't a money-making proposition. I didn't set out to be rich. You know, the first book on life in the universe, the physical environments, everything from stars to planets to oceans and atmospheres to possible life, the history of life on Earth. What pushed me down that path was the recognition that when I talked to students, when I taught classes for undergraduates, they were interested in the questions about life in the universe. I remember my first classes in planetary science didn't have any discussion of life. Then I added one day. We'll talk about life on Mars and the Viking missions. That one day expanded into a week, and it eventually expanded into a whole semester because I realized that that's what the kids were interested in. And it's not because they were way out in left field. they were expressing something that was inside of everybody, that interest. And I explored it in depth. I started to understand the issues and how it all came together. This was in the 1990s, at the same time that we were recognizing, just for the first time, the possibilities for life elsewhere. And I thought, how cool, I want to share this. So I wrote a book. At the time, I think it was the first book in what I would call the modern era of understanding the possibilities for life in the universe. And it was, to me, almost a life-changing event to explore in detail all of these different disciplines and how they come together. Changed my view of the world dramatically. And I realized, along with everybody else, how important the questions about life in the universe were and how fundamental they were to the science that we were engaged in.
And so you said, you that's like how the inception of the book. What's the process of writing a book like? I've never talked to an author firsthand that's written 2 books to just ask, wait, what's it like to write a book? How does that work?
Well, I've seen a good description of it. You just sit down in front of a blank piece of paper and cut open a vein, and it just all pours out. It's very daunting if you think of it as writing a book. But if you break it down into chapters, each one is very straightforward. In that book, I can't remember right now, I had about 20 chapters, and each one, when I sat down to write it, was very well defined. It was about 10 pages, 10 pages of 10 or 20, I forget now, pages of single space typed verbiage. And I know how to do that. It's very, very easy if you know what you want to say to write down the words. The hard part is thinking about what you want to say, organizing it, and making sure you've got everything covered. That said, it took me about 2 years to write that book because I also had other things that I had to do with my time. I would say it was about a year of effort spread over 2 years. And I remember when I was done, holding this manuscript in my hands and thinking, if I took this and just threw it in the trash can right now and walked away from it, it still would have been worth doing because of the impact it had on my thinking about how everything fit together in the universe.
That is awesome.
Looking at it, I love it.
I didn't do that. I didn't throw it, but I thought about what it would mean. It was just an interesting realization.
That's very cool.
Do you think that having experience writing scientific papers kind of helped with that, breaking it into 10 and 20 page chunks? It's very much like submitting a paper.
That's the point I was trying to make, that I know how to write a paper. I know how to write 10 pages because I've been doing that my whole career. So once I could break it down into 10-page chunks, it was very straightforward to write. Not easy. It still took a lot of effort, a lot of time. I can't tell you how many nights and weekends I spent working on that, but it was straightforward.
All right, so Dr. Bruce Joukowsky, thank you so much again for joining us. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
All right, and that wraps things up for this week's episode of A View from Earth. We'd like to thank our guests really quick, Dr. Luis Zia and Dr. Bruce Joukowsky, for giving us their time and talking a bit about life away from Earth. By the way, we cut their interviews down quite a bit to fit into our allotted time for the main episodes, but the full extended interviews are available on YouTube and SoundCloud. So if either of those really caught your eye, go ahead and check the extended interviews out. I think you'll like them a lot. Next week, we're going to be talking about citizen science with Michael Aya and Anya Portyankina. And that's going to be a lot of fun. The episode is titled, So You Want to Be an Astronomer? Do you? Check out the episode. Make sure to give a visit to our website, colorado.edu/FISC. And there you can leave us questions if you like, that we will then pass on to our experts. But also, from our website, there is an option to donate. If you'd like to be a part of this podcast and allow for its continuation into the future, we'd really appreciate that. So thank you. This podcast is available on YouTube, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And from us here at the View from Earth team, thank you for listening.